Hello and welcome to the Good Society Forum. My name is Emma Skye and I'm Director of Yale World Fellows and co-host of the Good Society Forum, which is a community of change makers around the world with a common quest to build the good society. My co-host is Nizamuddin of the Prince's Trust and a 2019 Yale World Fellow. Niz.
Thank you, Emma, and hello, everybody, and welcome. It's the 1st of July. We have just moved to our new regular slot of Wednesday. This time, every week is where you can expect the Good Society Forum webinars to take place as part of the world coming out of lockdown, and we know you have busy things to do on your Sunday, so we've heard you loud and clear. Thank you for being part of our global community. We are all dedicated to building the good society, as you all know. We are, for those of you who've just joined us for the first time, we are on social media. Please do follow us on Twitter at GoodSoc We are also on LinkedIn and we have a Facebook group. We're always keen to hear of new ideas and inspirations for webinars that are relevant to building the good society. So please do email us if you have any suggestions, info@goodsocietyforum.com. Plan today is to hear from our 4 speakers that we have, and then we're going to take your questions and have a Q&A with them. Now, we've not done this for a week, so it feels like it's been a while, but we want to know where you are all dialing in from. So if you wouldn't mind, you know the drill. What city are you currently in? If you could use a chat function that we have at the bottom right in the middle of your screen and just type in which city are you currently in, and we would love to see who we have. Brilliant. We have Rosina from Karachi in Pakistan. We have Azim from Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. Incredible. Monica from New York. Karen from Rochdale in the UK. Kieran from Rochdale in the UK. Janet from Amsterdam. Mark from Philadelphia. Malcolm from Glasgow. Marianne from New Haven. We have Megan from Mango in Togo. I don't think we've had Togo yet. That's so great to have you with us. Monte from Toronto. Malika, hi from North London. Our community continues to grow. Fatima from Cairo in Egypt. I'm still surprised every time we do this, just how incredibly diverse and global our community are. We're so lucky to have you. Thank you for joining us. Emma, what's on the agenda today?
Well, the pandemic has exposed deep fault lines in our societies, including the disproportionate health and economic impact on minority communities. A recent independent report in the UK, entitled Disparities in the Risk and Outcomes of COVID-19, confirmed that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups were more likely to die from COVID than their white counterparts. We have seen similar statistics in other nations, including Norway and the United States. Recent global protests in response to the murder of George Floyd and part of the Black Lives Matter movement have once again highlighted the historical and structural nature of why this disproportionately exists in the first place, with the Dean of Harvard University School of Public Health stating, "Racism is a public health issue." So just how do we move on from this historic moment and create a good society that truly embeds race equity at its heart? Our first speaker today is Dr. Matthew Matthews, a Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Institute of Policy Studies Social Lab, a Center for Social Indicator Research at the National University of Singapore. He has extensive experience covering issues relating to social cohesion and inclusion in Singapore, and he sits on a number of government and non-governmental panels, and is a research advisor to the Ministry of Social and Family Development. Matthew, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Emma. It's a great privilege to be part of this forum. Allow me to give you a little context as we think about the case of racial equity. And the Singaporean case is in many ways rather unique. Singapore is a very small city-state. As you might know, it's economically very well developed. At the core of Singapore's success has been the great emphasis on equity, especially racial equity. You probably might know that Singapore has been well known as a model for racial harmony, race relations. Some context here, one clear indicator of that kind of racial equity has been in the administration of public services, which has been very carefully done so that people of different races do not feel that they will be discriminated by public services. I do some large surveys every few years, and I have one which we've done 2 waves of the last couple of 5 years each. And we asked a very large sample, and we asked people about a whole range of things. And one part of the survey has got to do with how they feel they're treated in different kinds of public services, whether it's the police, the court system, social welfare, hospitals, public transport, schools, and whether they feel that there's a difference in treatment between themselves and people of other races. In fact, we noticed that less than 10% of minorities reported being treated worse than others. So from that perspective, we do see quite a bit of racial equity in terms of how minorities receive public services. But it will be unfair to say that there is no racism here. And Singapore is certainly not a multicultural nirvana. We don't see ethnic strife or racial violence, especially since the last 50 or so years since the country gained independence from the British. However, we do have, from the same surveys, we do know that about a third, about 30% or so of minorities report that they feel that they're treated differently when it comes to jobs, and a number of them feel that they are stopped from promotions or getting into a job because of their ethnic background. So there is some sense of discrimination. There's also a sense that there's a glass ceiling for minorities, where quite a few minorities feel that they have to work much harder if they want to move up to top positions within society. Now, Singapore gained independence from the British, and after independence, the early national leaders, this was in 1965, enshrined the importance of equality of the different races. Singapore was among the few countries where after independence, there was a very, very strong notion that racial equality was important. Many other countries had chosen the path of following the majority ethnic group in terms of whether it's language or cultural policy. Singapore tried a system where it was very it was supposed to be very multiracial. We have a very large proportion of ethnic Chinese in Singapore. 75% of our population are ethnic Chinese. About 14% are ethnic Malay, people of the Indonesian, the Malaysian heritage. About 7% are Indian, and a small portion are Eurasian and people of other ethnic backgrounds. But very important part of the pledge very early on was that it's called regardless of race, language, and religion. And this is something that it's a national pledge which is stated by children every morning in school. It's very much part of the Singapore ethos, and people talk about this aspiration often. With that has been a number of intrusive policies, and if racial equity is going to be possible, then it seems, at least the Singapore model seems to show that you need to be interventionistic in this regard. One area that intervention has happened and probably has been quite successful has been in dictating how the places people live in. And now Singapore was a little concerned about 20, 30 years ago in the 1980s, we're concerned that people did live in different districts based on their ethnic background. There was, for instance, a larger proportion of minorities in some areas and neighborhoods. And with that, then, of course, a concern that over time, those areas would become ghettos. And so there was a national program, it's called the Ethnic Integration Policy, where in public housing, now public housing is what 80% of Singaporeans live in. And in public housing, there will always be a quota. So you will have to have a mixture of people of different ethnic backgrounds within each residential neighborhood. Now, as a result of that, naturally, what you have is that of course, you naturally have quite a bit of intermingling of people with different ethnic backgrounds. But more importantly, is that you do have, schools, for instance, which are located near neighborhoods, would naturally have a diversity, a good mix of people from different backgrounds within the school. So you don't have situations where you've got entire neighborhoods which are of a particular ethnic group, and then therefore receiving a different kind of treatment. So all across the nation, you've got people of different ethnic backgrounds residing in fairly similar spaces. And I think that has worked very well for Singapore in terms of ensuring that there has been equity as far as neighborhoods are concerned in the provision. I won't go through many more of the other parts of it, but you do still, despite that, you do see the fact that there are different kinds of outcomes. Minorities, for instance, are known to have higher incidence of being incarcerated for drug issues, for alcoholism. And the model that Singapore uses is that when they notice, or when policymakers and administration notice that there are differential outcomes, then there seems to be an intervention that happens along racial lines. Now, some people argue that by doing this, you accentuate the importance of race. But in Singapore, that has been part of the mechanism by which you bring equity, by calling out racial differences and then dealing with that as it needs to be done. I'll be happy to explain more of this later once we have more time. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you so much, and especially thank you because it's 1 a.m. where you are. So we're so grateful for your commitment to allowing your expertise to be shared with the rest of the world that we have with us. So our next speaker I am delighted to invite is Mr. Mark Gonzalez, who's an award-winning chair of the Department of the Future, a creative strategic agency that works at the intersection of technology, design thinking, and theories of change. Mark is a former visiting professor at Stanford University. He's worked closely with the first Black Council president of the Los Angeles City Council, Herb J. Wesson, with Embrace LA project that led to the creation of the Office of Racial Equity. He is an Angelino with a global presence and is currently joining us from the city of Sousse in Tunisia. Mark.
Thank you, Nizam. So I'll just provide a little bit of a backdrop to the audience, I think both of this moment and how the Office of Racial Equity began as a concept, then transformed into a design and engagement strategy, how it was built, and also the role it's played, both good and bad, in terms of how the city of Los Angeles is responding to the COVID cases. Embrace LA was a citywide initiative started, I believe, around 2016, 2017 by Council President Herb Wesson, who had this idea about how do we start a citywide conversation on race, and how do we do it in a city that is the size of most countries? To give the audience a background, the Los Angeles GDP is approximately $1 trillion, $950 billion annually. Our city itself is about 5 million residents, spanning 15 council districts, which are all elected. And that city then sits within a county of 12 million people. Around 2012, at the time, then President Obama called for a national conversation on race. In 2016, after the recent administration's election, we realized there still was no national conversation on race. In 2017, there was no national conversation on race. Some would say in 2020, we still haven't had a national conversation on race. What we have had are a bunch of monologues and diatribes, if you will. So we began with the conversation looking from a city's perspective. How can we support a city in learning dialogue skills and helping residents build civic responsibilities in ways that are not taught in public schools? How can we do that in a city the scale of Los Angeles and acknowledge the algorithms that only connect you with information and individuals you're already in agreement with? And how do we do that in ways that move beyond the optics of the dialogue across different photo op and really look at recalibrating social norms and reshaping policy? We began asking with our local partners, specifically Community Coalition, of what were the frameworks and the ways of engaging residents? And we realized that a lot of people wanted to have conversations, but actually felt that they didn't know how to have them, or that there were spaces that they could be honest and openly engage with. So Community Coalition, which is a major racial dignity organization in South Los Angeles, founded by Congresswoman Karen Bass, basically put together their neighborhood team and provided us with about 40 individuals who we could train in dialogue methodologies. We custom built a website that allowed Angelenos to sign up regardless of what district they were in, and to share why they may or may not want to be a part of a dialogue on racial equity in the city of Los Angeles. Within about 4 to 5 days, we had 3,000 signups for about 1,000 to 1,200 slots. We then built a model that said there's 15 districts. Let's do 25 dinners and dialogues a day with one in each district for 4 days straight, equaling the 100 dinners. And then we will actually place a trained dialogue methodology person at each of the dinners across the districts. I'll show you all a little bit of what that looks like in terms of trainings.
Mark, I can't see anything, Mark.
Oh.
Mark, we can hear your music.
Yes.
But we can't see anything just yet.
Oh, you couldn't see anything. Okay, well, that had the sharing screen, so we will try this again.
There we go.
Perfect. And apologies if that didn't work. And I'll add one thing as we show a little bit of our kind of breakdown of Embrace LA as a case study, if you will, which is for us, it was essential that those who were the closest to the pain and the closest to the problem were the people who were leading the dialogue. And by leading a dialogue, it wasn't just inviting a bunch of people to sit around a table. It was really talking about what we love about the city that we all live in, but also about how that city has hurt us and how race shapes our love and our pain in that city. And then to use that space for a place of honest and authentic engagement about what are the roadblocks that are preventing us from being the city we want to be. As I mentioned, we had 3,000 signups for 1,500 spots, 100 hosts, leading to 15 city districts. What I will also add is that one of the main things that we kept on thinking about was if we were going to talk about, you could say Martin Luther King's beloved community and the city that we want to be, or in this case, the good society. Then we felt it was also important to fold in the parts of the city that are often left out of these types of engagements. So we made sure that every dinner we had, no matter where it was at, that we also designated one dinner at Skid Row, one dinner at elderly homes, especially with high amounts of elder isolation and social isolation in most cities, a dinner specifically in the LA youth prisons, as well as the reentry homes and for arriving refugees and immigrant communities. And I will pause there and pass it on to our next speaker. Oh, Emma.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was great music. I could see you bopping along. Really, really inspiring work. And our next speaker is Tabassum Rashid, who's Deputy CEO at the Black Training and Enterprise Group in the UK, which is a national charity delivering programs for young Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people aged 11 to 30 years old. And Tebs has over 25 years of experience working in the areas of criminal justice, race equality, mental health, abuse and domestic violence, education and employment. And she's a member of the Mayor of London's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group. Tebs, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. First of all, thank you for that amazing introduction, and thank you, Mark, and for your talk, because actually what you said actually echoes a lot of what I'm going to say. But before I do, I was pleased to be asked to speak here, partly because this is the space to talk about solutions and moving forward. There is lots of spaces and continued need to have spaces to still talk about what the issues are. But I think there needs to be more spaces to talk about, well, what now? How do we embed change and equity and equality? So I was really pleased to receive the remit, so to speak. So yeah, I worked in social injustice for about 30 years now, actually, so it's more than 25, as my profile talks about. And in the charity I work for at the moment, I've been there 16 years, currently the Deputy Chief Executive of a national charity NGO that tackles inequalities, race inequalities in criminal justice, education and employment. There are our core areas, but of course we expand beyond that. And I think my point, so I've got a number of points, but my starting point is that to change inequalities, to embed race equity, we need to embed all the way through, not just as we've had in the past, systems being set up, departments being set up, and they're kind of more of an add-on. They're departments that look at equality and diversity as an add-on. But actually what we need to see is actually something that's at the core of every organisation in every sector. Because what we're talking about, what we're seeing now with everything that's going on, this is both personal and systemic. And so for me, I'm always keen to see an approach that's both top down and bottom up as well. So it's got to be top down in terms of looking at systems, looking at policy, changing that, influencing that, and not just by the policy makers. I think Mark touched on the fact that it's got to be co-produced. It's got to have people involved that know what the issues are and understand and have lived them, to be part of that conversation, part of that design, part of that development. But it's also about the personal. It's also about bottom up, actually changing communities, changing individuals, and those people that have those stereotypes, that have the, I suppose, the mindsets that need to be changed. So it's looking at individuals and behaviours at individual level, which I truly believe that if they're not questioned and challenged, which then become part of the culture of the organisation they're working in, and if it's not challenged there, it starts becoming systemic. So both personal and systemic go hand in hand, in my view. So some specifics I thought I'll touch on. I think embedding equity has to start in education at a very young level and across education. Every child, regardless of whether it's here in the UK or across the world, every child should have the right to quality and inclusive education. It shouldn't be based on a lottery, based on education or the lack of cultural competency by staff, teaching staff and non-teaching staff. So that whole education system needs to kind of completely review how it operates, the systems within it, the people that are working it, and understanding cultural nuances and the differences and the diversity within the people, the young people, the children, the parents they're working with. Some of my work is, as I said, around the criminal justice system. I think, again, going hand in hand with the other work, it's the need to continuously challenge the oppression within systems like criminal justice. And again, this goes across the world. Systems are oppressive, it's a fact. But there is the disproportionate outcomes. So through policy, yes, through BTEC, the work I'm doing, we're constantly working with ministers, constantly working with policymakers to kind of make those changes. And yes, they're listening. There's no doubt that, yes, they want to make change, they want to create policies, and they do. They sit behind the desk, they create the documents, and it's all good. But the problem is, it doesn't filter down. So when we're talking about top down, it kind of, yes, there's all the right kind of noises and the right kind of intentions and investments at the top level, but for some reason, it doesn't filter down to those police officers, to the magistrates, to the probation officers, prison officers, etc. So for some reason, we need to kind of keep banging on about changing that system and challenging the disproportionate outcomes faced by Black, Asian, Muslim, particularly young people here in the UK anyway. For me, it's also about change to the language, and this is across the board. Language has too much, we have too much racialized language in everything, whether it's the media, whether it's marketing stuff, whether it's within culture and arts. The language needs to be changed, the narratives need to be changed, which if they're not, if we carry on the way we are, then that labeling, the stigma, the unconscious biases that we've all talking about, they will continue. No one's going to challenge. So that those things can only change, the equity can only come into play if we start challenging the languages that we're all using, again, both individually, in communities, but also within systems and processes. I think employment is another big area, partly because it is an area we work with in our charity, but in terms of employment, yeah, people can get jobs, but for us, why is there so much disproportionality within the ranks? Why is there not enough progression of BAME, Black minority ethnic communities within the sectors, any sectors, whether it's public, private, within corporate, whether it's finance, whether it's legal? We need to constantly kind of equip minority individuals and communities with managing and challenging the system, but then also working with the system itself, working with employers to look at employment practices, to look at recruitment, to look at progression. So one of the things we do at VTEG, we always try and have a two-pronged approach. So yes, we're working with young Black men to get them into careers, not just jobs, but at the same time, we are also working with the employers to get them to understand their biases, their systems that need to be questioned. So again, I'm keep going about systems, but that is for us a big part of how we're going to make the change we need. For me, it's also about, I think something that Mark touched on, but it's about creating the platforms, very much about creating the platforms to have the difficult conversations. We do that through VTEG, lots of other organizations do that. So we need to continuously talk about racism, but not just racism on its own. We need to look at the intersecting issues and identify those blind spots to hold each other to account. So those platforms have got to be created more and more. We've had a whole decade, I think, where they've disappeared. So we need to create those spaces for those people that are comfortable with the topic, but also for those people that are now very uncomfortable. So to create those spaces. For us in the sector in the UK, we are constantly challenging why there's not enough investment into minority projects, into Black projects. Why is that trust not there? Why is that disproportionate? So there's something about, again, something I was touched on earlier about the co-production, the joint working, reach out to communities rather than trying to pretend you know what they want. For us, that's a key part. So that cultural competency, having the right people involved, Mark, you talked about the design thinking approach, very much advocate for that. For me, it's also about linked to that embedding diversity of thought in everything, in all decision making, in all design processes, to have diversity of thought. So it's not just an add-on, it is part and parcel of every stage of design. And also, I think the last thing I'll finish on, which is what I started with, in terms of embed this, it's not got to be a separate thing. It's got to be the capacity in every organization, whether it's a private company, whether it's a local authority, public, or a voluntary community sector, NGO type organization, every sector, the capacity has got to be inbuilt into the organization to make these changes, not just a department on its side. Oh, we've got an EDI team, great. But they sit separately and they're not actually weaving in to every other decision-making point, which is where the diversity of thought concept, I think, should be played out all the way through. So for me, just to finish, I think I'm running out of time. For me, it is across the board, it's got to be intersecting, it's got to be both personal and systems for the change to happen in terms of looking at equity being embedded in our future and our society.
Awesome, thank you so much. You've highlighted, I think, the sheer complexity of some of the issues that we're trying to unravel today, and we know we're not going to do it in an hour, so this is very much the start of the conversation. And so the one thing I did want to say is, before we bring our final speaker, and if you have questions, you know the drill, please do put them into the chat function, and we will be having a Q&A after our final speaker. Our final speaker, we're so glad is joining us, and I really am worried about getting the name wrong. Bongeni Alan Magubane, I really hope I haven't butchered it, Deputy Headmaster at the prestigious St. John's College in Johannesburg, South Africa, where he also teaches social justice. Alan has worked in the corporate sector as a leadership, ethics and strategy consultant. He is an alumnus of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies and was a summer fellow, a school fellow at Drew University Center on Religion, Culture and Conflict in Madison, New Jersey. Alan's research interests are in social justice, theology, and I love this, love as a social and political ethic to building justice in the world. Alan, we're so glad that you've joined us and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Niz. Can you hear me?
We can.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emma. Thank you to my fellow panelists, Matthew, Mark, and Tebs. I've been taking copious notes. And Matthew, goodness, I really need to visit you in Singapore. It sounds like you've got some good stuff to tell there. And South Africa desperately needs that. And just by way of a brief kind of snapshot of the South African landscape, before kind of zooming in, and I'll speak a little bit more on education and what we're trying to do in the education space. Granted, I'm working in the private education space, which is also nuanced in particular ways. But I mean, if South Africa has come to exist it's a colonial project, right? The histories of which we can connect to Dutch and British rule, and we can go from that into apartheid, which becomes this economic, political, and social order that really divided the country along racial lines, and obviously jumping. I'm doing massive jumps here, but jumping to the 1994 transition, which the country and the world, really the world over, hailed us as having done smoothly, and Nelson Mandela having been one of the key celebrating, the key role players in that, being celebrated as being responsible for this transition. One of the narratives that come with that is that of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who ran our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in some ways, South Africa, with its progressive constitution, and still has one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, which I think is really fantastic. But with our reconciliation narrative, in some ways, look as a country that avoided a civil war based on race. And I think that was a profoundly, apologies for that. There are a number of things that then happened with that, with the narrative that we as a country survived and took and went into a transition that would fundamentally look as though race relations were not tight. And I think that one of the things that you have seen in this country is a country that still remains deeply racially divided. The township as a social space, or rather a geopolitical feature of the South African landscape, is a place or a neighborhood or an urban configuration that characterizes most of Black identity in South Africa. And I think that one of those things that if you look at South Africa by its configuration, 76% African, about 9% white, about 8 to 9% colored, or what would be characterized as mixed race around the world, and around 2% Asian. Now, what that has also resulted in, I think, is that you had in 1994 Black or African leadership take political power, but white economic power remain. And so you had both a Cold War that has existed in the last couple of years, in the last couple of decades since the dawn of democracy, a Cold War between the Black political power and the white economic power, but equally a weird marriage that's taken place there. And I think that has resulted in particular kinds of advances, but also regressions in the ways in which the South African state has formulated. And Tebs, I really agree with you, particularly, I'm going to jump around a little bit, but on the ways in which I think these questions are so need necessarily be intersectional, because in South Africa, one cannot talk about racial divisions and racial equity without talking about the question of gender. And in South Africa, we face one of the biggest gender crises, particularly in relation to gender-based violence in the world. The vulnerability of Black women and the violence against Black women in particular is particularly rife. And so, to follow on, one cannot speak about race in South Africa without talking about class. And I think that connects to the Black political control and the white economic control. And so much of the working lower class is the Black majority in this country. And I think that part of those things is, you know, I was quite touched for Mark to quote Martin Luther King's beloved community, because that's informed so much of my work and continues to, you know. And one quote from him, he says, "Our goal is to create a beloved community that will require a qualitative change in our souls, as well as a quantitative change in our lives." And I think that's a really interesting philosophical concept, but a wonderful ideological map for some of the things that we need to attend to, and to focus in on the schooling space that we're working on. So from the qualitative change, I think we need to be doing far more soul work and heart work than we are. And I think that with the quantitative changes, you know, you're talking about racial literacy. We now teach social justice as a subject in the school. It's a standalone subject, not attached to anything else, and students attend that. You've got teacher learning programs around social justice. We have parent dialogue. So our parents, if they bring their children to our school, are expected in some ways to participate in a course that alongside their time for the duration of their child's enrollment in the school. And I think that is also in conversation with governmental efforts, right? Where in our country, some of the structural reform, this quantitative change has looked like affirmative action being legislated. It's looked like socioeconomic support being lended to the poor working class, which is majority African. It's looked like social cohesion being a strategic imperative and resolution of our cabinet. And so all of those things are this quantitative change, but the qualitative change, I think, requires an inward journey, a softer, deeper look at what's happening in the heart. And one of the things, just to conclude, because I think I might have run out of time, is the question of how we begin to think and speak about these things as it relates to the heart and the mind and the soul. The children we try to teach and expose to concepts of social justice go home and interact with a different curriculum. And that curriculum is a result of their parents' ideologies, their histories, their backgrounds, and so on. And so I try to think and wrestle with this qualitative change in the soul and a quantitative change in our lives. And I think we get the quantitative change in our lives well with the structural reform, with the steps that we need to do, the conversations. But sometimes the qualitative change in the soul is a harder thing. It's hard to stand up and we must speak about our souls. It's hard to, and it's not something, I think it's actually crucial that we do that, right? And I think it's an important imperative to try and understand the very unilateral principle that informs the beloved community to begin with, right? Because that unilateral principle says we are human. We're human together. We are human as we're part of a human family. And so those shared values must not just translate in the legislative frameworks that we create, but equally in trying to connect that humanity to each other. And I think one of the main things, to close off in conclusion, sorry, Liz, is that one of the things I think about quite a lot is about our proximity and engagement with intersectional and Black feminist theory, right? And my niece, Gogo Londi, she's fantastic in exposing me to this, because I think that if we begin to think and read through the intersectional frameworks that I find from Black feminist theology, feminist theories and discourse around the world, whether you're looking at a Kimberly Crenshaw or Arundhati Roy and a number of people who write, I think they offer us these intersectionalities to realize that supremacist thinking is part of our biggest problem. And the children of supremacist thinking is racism. The children of supremacist thinking is sexism, is homophobia, is ableism and ageism. So how do we begin to train the supremacist detection barometer in each other? How do we begin to start seeing those things that say to us, this has created a hierarchy of value in the human family that should not exist? many questions, trying to find some answers. Thank you. Yeah.
Alan, that was incredible. And you know, I mean, that was incredible. I mean, Matthew, Tebs, Mark, Alan, we know this topic is a deeply complex topic. We know an hour is not enough. We know each of you very intentionally not only has a different country context, but you bring a very specific sectoral context too. And that's exactly why it was wonderful to hear from all of you in terms of speaking. We have about 20 minutes for this Q&A. We know it's not going to be enough, so I'm going to try and whiz through some of these questions. If I could ask you to be as succinct as possible, I'd really, really appreciate it. So I want to kick off by asking a question in your context, both country and sector, which is today's topic is how do you build racial equity into the good society? Right now within your world, I would like for you to tell us, where is racial inequality most prevalent in your context? And I think that will give us a good flavor from which to start. And maybe I can start with Matthew first. You're on mute, Matthew.
Yeah, I think racial inequality in terms of access to the best jobs, access to good employment, that's something that minorities in Singapore struggle with. And that's something that takes more than just the work of policy and policy equal, employment opportunities. All those things are important. But the next step about how to ensure that people, employers are able to go beyond people's skin color, their ethnic background, to be able to employ fairly. I think that's one of the big challenges that we're dealing with. Brilliant.
And Tebs, if I can come to you next, where is inequality most rampant from a racial perspective in the UK?
The quick answer is everywhere, but from our point of view, we've got more data around criminal justice, and so therefore I can say with more confidence it's more rampant. So the inequalities in terms of stop and search here in the UK, the prison sentencing inequalities, the way Black people are treated in the system, all of that, we've got more data on that, which is why we can say that is much more rampant. However, we all know that employment, education, it's all there. So there's something about actually within all the sectors we need to kind of push for more data. Yeah, the ethnicity pay gap, you know, why Black people paid less for the same job. You know, that's a big debate that's going on here, I'm sure, across the world. But yeah, for me, I'd say criminal justice, because when you start losing trust in the authorities, it then has a knock-on effect on the younger generations and the older generations as well.
Tebs, thank you. And on the question of trust, Mark, from your experience and the work that you've done, where is racial inequality, so that we get a good picture of what we're looking to try and solve here? You're on mute.
I think I could share a lot of statistics, but we'll make it a little bit more personal, which is, I'm sure everyone on this call has known someone who's passed from COVID. And so the easiest way to think about it is we're dying. Across the world, in nearly every society, people of original populations, indigenous populations, and stolen populations are dying at 2 to 3 times the rate. And our visions for racial equity are so small that we're asking only to die at the same rate as others.
Wow, Mark, thank you for that. Alan, Kathleen in the group in the group chat has asked you to restate the quote that you put forward to us, and I think it was an MLK quote. If you can share that, as well as answer the question in a South African context or an education context for you, where is the deepest racial inequality in South Africa?
Thank you. Our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls as well as a quantitative change in our lives. To answer the question, everywhere here, our children, Black children, majority in the public system, everywhere, the configuration of urban living, and there's an emergent Black middle class, but South Africa still remains with one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. And so wherever you go, the chances are that the working class people in that environment are people of color, are Black people, are African people, the economically mobile people will be white people. It's everywhere here. It's private education is majority white by attendance by teacher hiring and by student population. In our healthcare system, the private system services a majority or white clientele alongside a Black emerging Black middle class. But it's everywhere. It's everywhere in mass incarceration. It's everywhere in gender-based violence. It's everywhere in some of the police brutalities we've seen in the lockdowns in the last 2 months, 3 months, that you're seeing cases and deaths taking place by the military or the police in only Black communities. So it's everywhere. Liz, I wish I could pin out one thing for you to say that this is the one thing where I think it shows up the most. I think it's everywhere.
No, and I think, Alan, that's the point. I think, when we talk about embedding racial equity into society, I think by asking that question is to let everybody know, and for us to just articulate loudly, it's systemic. It's not just this one thing that can be fixed. So Alan, I have a question for you. I mean, we've seen, and I'll go to Tebs later about this, we've seen the tragic murder of George Floyd provoke a reaction based out of decades, if not centuries, of pain from many Black communities. How has that translated to the young people, perhaps, that you work with or in South Africa as a whole? We don't see enough of the impact of what we're seeing with Black communities in, say, America and the response in parts of Africa. What's been the response in South Africa? Is that something that you can share?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that just in terms of the South African private schooling space, we've seen quite an interesting kind of pushback, massive ruptures taking place across private school systems across the country, sparked by the George Floyd conversation and tragedy, but also speaking and reflecting on historical systemic racism within particularly private schools within the South African context. So we've seen those ruptures take place across the system, and I think many of those young people have taken to social media to drive their campaigns. We've seen alumni from various schools, what would be called former Model C schools, so public schools, but that are predominantly white, and alumni speak out there. And I think that has also been in conversation with some of a big working class conversation, because we have a Collins Khosa who is our George Floyd. We have a number of people who died, and so that's also been in conversation with a globalized American perspective, which in some ways brings urgency to some issues. But those real brutalities and tragedies and catastrophes happening in our own backyard. And I think the feedback or the response has been, and I'll speak specifically for the education context, has been particularly around a pushback on racist institutional cultures in schools and a placing of urgency on parent bodies, staff bodies, and governance bodies of those schools to take steps against dismantling structural racism and supremacy. Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. And I think just seeing as we're staying away from the West, if you will, I mean, Singapore, Matthew, is there anything you can share about the response to what we've been seeing in Singapore and around Southeast Asia in particular?
With George, I mean, the unfortunate tragedies that people have seen, especially in other parts of the world, has made Singaporeans sit up and have a little bit more conversation about some of those issues, not to take for granted that there are inequalities. As I mentioned earlier, Singapore is fortunate that in most metrics, we hardly see any, there's probably been no racial violence for many, many years. I mean, so in many ways, I think we take for granted the state of general harmony that we have. And it also, I mean, does, breed a certain sense by, for instance, the broader population that, the experience of all groups is similar. But the fact is it's not. Qualitatively, minorities do have some kind of differences, as I mentioned, employment, for instance. So there's been quite a bit of discussion about it. People have talked a little bit about some of the concerns. Every so often, some incident kind of raises some of this awareness, and certainly the George Floyd issue and some of the some of the protests that have been going on have made people be a little bit more concerned. One, about the fact that if you're a majority person, then there is notions about privilege that sometimes is not discussed. But increasingly people are aware about the fact that there is privilege. In Southeast Asia, sorry.
Please, I interrupted. Please finish.
Yeah, I think different parts of Southeast Asia. Now, the effect has been different in different parts here in Southeast Asia. But in general, I think there's always been discussion, because in all these parts of Southeast Asia, you do have a large majority population living with lots of minorities, and minorities who feel in different ways that they've been disenfranchised at different levels. So there's been quite a bit of discussion and talk. And I'm glad all over Southeast Asia, there's been many people who are from the majority ethnic backgrounds who've been very supportive and been discussing about the importance of racial equalities in their cities.
Matthew, thank you. And Tebs, I want to come to you with almost an extension of what Matthew has said, and a question that Mark has asked in the chat, which is, within anthropology, race is not a biological fact, but rather is a social and cultural construct. In the UK context, we know, the term BAME, for example, Black, Asian, and ethnic or minority ethnic, encapsulates just within Black, you have Caribbean and African experiences. How is that differentiated, and do we need to do a better job? Because obviously saying BAME effectively means non-white. And so how do we differentiate the conversation to build racial equity if we're using a catch-all phrase like BAME?
Well, deep and long-ended question. I mean, there's two things here. Yes, there is a need to have a conversation and debate about language and terminology, and where does race, racism, BME, BAME, Black, Asian, where does all this sit? My little bit of worry is that if we get drawn into that now, we're diverting away from the big issues. Yes, there is a space for that, so I'm not denying that. But what seems to be happening, and I'm seeing this quite a lot in my work, is a little bit of diversion. And let's talk about the words, let's talk about the language, and forgetting about the big stuff. So yes, there's a bigger debate there. I'm involved in some conversations about what race and racism is now in this century, in this decade, compared to what it was 20 years ago, 100 years ago. Because the generation of my niece, for example, see that very differently to what I've experienced. So we're having all these conversations, and there is a space for that. Just going back to the previous question, I do want to say that, yes, there has been a ripple effect, and rightly so. But I personally, but my colleagues in the sector working in equality and race equality are a little bit exhausted and a little bit frustrated as well, that it takes something like this to again raise its head. The ripple effect is there. Just today, in one day, I've had 24 requests from private companies, from local authorities, from art galleries, you name it, saying, please, can you come and help us with unconscious bias training? Please, can you come and do a review and audit of us? And all of a sudden, everybody wants us. We've been talking about this for nearly 30 years. BTEC's been around 30 years talking about race inequality, social injustice, etc. And we're having to bang our heads against the wall. Now, all of a sudden, they need us, which is great. We're here for them. But it's just so sad that there is a momentum, and I'm a little bit worried that then what? So we've got to manage this momentum and make sure that these organizations, these individuals are genuinely, I do believe most of them are genuinely reaching out to us because it's been a real wake-up call that follow through. That it's not just, all right, we've done something and we've ticked some boxes. So for me, the impact is massive. I do believe that we're in a stronger position because they need us rather than we need them kind of space. But I am worried that not enough of us are looking at, and then what? The strategies and the work that needs to go beyond this current conversation. So that's what I'm focused on myself and our organization. So yes, there's a space for Black Lives Matters and what they're doing, and other campaigners and individuals and groups. Absolutely, that they need to keep kind of the issues on the agendas. But what some of us need to do is also work behind the scenes and on the strategies as well.
Incredible, Tebs, thank you. That's incredibly powerful intervention there. Mark, I have a question. Please feel free to respond to what you've heard so far. Monte has asked a brilliant question, which I won't read out because it's both, it's lots of nuances to it, but effectively, good civics is culture expressed in the creative visual arts, culture expressed in music, culture expressed in rhetoric, inclusive of literature. And I know you fundamentally, as somebody who understands the arts incredibly well, and the importance of narratives and how we portray narratives. So how important is the culture, arts, narratives in how we understand race equity in a society? And what more could governments be doing in particular to promote that agenda? And should it be as important as, say, employment or education, for example? You're on mute, Mark.
We could spend an entire hour on that conversation alone. I think there's a lot of interest in arts and culture and society, if you will. There's Arts and Society incubators. Stanford's getting ready to launch one. We just had a conversation with them. Other societies, the British Arts Council invests heavily, not only in the UK, but the role of arts and bilateral relationships between country. But to your bigger question, which is neurolinguistics, remind us that the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we're embedded within societies shape human behavior. And then behavior is ultimately what drives people, and then people drive policy. And so I think we have to remember this correlation, that these two are not disconnected. And to say it's not an either or, going back to the kind of race as biological myth, social construct, the frame we act as a biological myth, but a social reality. So I can change my cognitive frame, but that doesn't change the systems. Although it is an essential part of changing the systems itself. And I think these kind of dovetails or parallel tracks are essential. And to kind of go back to, I think, a larger underlying question, I think two things are essential in all the work that are being done, which is one, you listen to the people who are impacted and who are being harmed the most. And they'll tell you if their quality of life is improving or if their life expectancy is improving. And if not, as a society, then we just lean in and say, okay, how can we do this better? It doesn't have to be so charged or anything except just to say, hey, we want people to live longer and to live better lives. Is that happening? If not, then we need to pivot in our approach, individually and systemically. I think one thing that I would really recommend to people is that there's a lot of conversation on truth and reconciliation, which I think is an essential part of healing any society. But I think we kind of jump to reconciliation. And I think that, remember that is on the table. You know, that's one possible outcome. But before anything, actually, it's the truth and recognition process. But if we freeze society at a truth and recognition process, then we're freezing us to memory-only creatures. And we forget that time extends forward to our children and future generations. And so I think just as we have to invest into truth and recognition, then we also need to invest into social innovation and future gazing about the society we want to be. How do you create the good society conversations in cities across the world, where everyday people can participate in about what is the beloved community, the good society, the ideal space they want to be a part of. And then it's not only something that's being legislative, because I'm a firm believer you can't legislate the human heart, that it's something that they're actually seeing that this is something I want to be a part of and that I commit to. And now it's bi-directional.
Mark, thank you. I'm going to have to stop you there. I'm just conscious of time. We're going to go a few minutes over. I apologize in advance. And at the same time, I don't, because the conversation is so important. Alan, I want to come to you. And Mark, we will take you up on your offer of doing trust tables across the world for the good society. So we're looking forward to that. Alan, I have a question from Kiran here, which is, how would you encourage or set up a parent-child dialogue, or help parents in particular feel comfortable having conversations around social justice?
Questions of social justice in education are about protecting children. They're about protecting children, and that's what I would and try to communicate to parents. It's not a convenience, it's not a social capacitating you navigating the world. Us being able to communicate and teach and dialogue with parents around social justice and what that does for the consciousness of children is an imperative of protecting and loving children, which is core to what education is about. So what we've done here is to say, for the first few years, and we're in the first few years, it is optional. And at some point, it's no longer going to be optional for parents to miss these dialogues. It's a part of a parental contract. So, which is a lot of what I hear my fellow panelists speaking to, the relationship between structure and heart and how structure informs behavior. and legislation in some ways can help us guide people's behaviors. But I think one of those things that we do with the parent bodies is to write it into the contract, but equally realize and communicate its importance in the protection of our children and giving them a quality education.
Alan, thank you. Matthew, I have a question for you, very specific. Malcolm has asked a question about the team versus the individual. I'm going to extract that a bit more and want to understand from you the role of the political system, because in Singapore, you rightly said that it's easier for a government to intervene in areas that it might be more difficult. Do you think the system of governance in Singapore has enabled a more interventionist approach, as you've said, to embed racial equity? Is that more helpful? And is democracy part of the problem as to why we have racial inequality?
Well, I mean, Singapore is by any definition.
My apologies, yeah.
It's a democracy. We're having our elections now. Right now, this season, is an election season. But the notion about in Singapore does push out interventionist policies, but it's based on the fact that the population does believe that sometimes for some core areas, if you don't have intervention, if states acting for the collective body of society does not try to push, then essentially what you have is that, I mean, people choose their own path. And very often when it comes to issues to do with issues on race, people do feel that, I mean, we've got, I mean, there's long histories of supremacist thinking. In Asia, I mean, Singapore is, I mean, we've got people from different parts of Asia, and everyone comes with a culture which feels that their heritage, their language must be primary. And if there was no state which had been a negotiator and trying to be an interventionist force to try to bring some kind of parity, Singaporeans naturally accept the fact that society will go in chaos. So I think people come to accept intervention if they look at the bigger picture of what it would bring into society. So Singapore is a democracy. I think there is quite a bit of national consensus about the importance of intervention till today, with lots of Singaporeans being very, very exposed to liberal ideals, do feel that still we will have to have clear legislation against hate speech, for instance, about a speech which denigrates different kind of different people of different races or religion. So people accept the fact that this is something important if we're going to build the kind of racially harmonious society we want.
Matthew, thank you. And it serves me right for not using the right nuance and language with an academic. So I apologize and thank you again. So we're out of time. So I have one last question that I want to ask everybody. It's going to be 2 parts. I need to be really quick. One, which is what's giving you hope during the COVID period in particular? And 2, if there's one thing that you could magically do to help address this topic of race equity, what would that one thing be? And Mark, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, no pressure. What has kept me hopeful is I have a 5.5-year-old who speaks 4 languages and has 3 passports, and a 2-year-old who's learning 3 languages at the same time. And I'm reminded every day when I wake up and I go to sleep that the generation that's coming has a very not only different relationship to identity, but to the world in difference than any of us had the opportunity to have. And what keeps me hopeful is that I can try to be open enough to nudge it and encourage it forward, knowing that it's already there. And as long as I center that, then all else falls into place. In terms of what I would like to see, I think the Black Lives Matter platform in Los Angeles of reimagining public safety, if we took that as a framework and as a wireframe across the world of what are all the systems that we need to re-envision, because so much of our life is done out of habit and out of what is norm. And I think if we can create the spaces for some deep future gazing and future labs, and perhaps align it with UN SDGs, and support it in innovative ways, then I think we're going to see some really amazing things emerge over the next 10 years.
Mark, thank you so much. Teb, same two questions to you.
Okay, wow, that was a tough question. So in terms of hope, what's made me not feel so exhausted is the fact there are so many collective voices, so many people coming out. I don't mind the pun there, but coming together, I suppose. And these are not just your normal activists, not just the Black community, but there is a lot more voices coming together, joining up, really getting it and moving on with the campaign. So that's given me hope that it's not just us as a lone voice. So that has really changed kind of my energy level. And just very quickly, the second part's a really hard question, but I suppose if I really want to hone it in, and this is UK specific, and it might resonate with others as well, is if the curriculum changed here, because at the moment our curriculum is so narrow, it's so British and English, it doesn't incorporate cultures, diversity, history from around the world. If that started changing, if the curriculum from a very young age started including that kind of stuff, then that generational change and mindsets and openness would come with that.
Teb, thank you so much. And I'm going to go to Alan next. What's given you hope, and one thing that you could change, what would it be?
Much like Mark, it's the children. Today I spent the whole day with a group of young leaders in my school who had written a 28-page document about some of the key questions of inclusive education. 15, 16-year-olds giving us nuanced understanding of what the key concerns of critical education are and inclusive education. That gives me hope, alongside kind of the global outpouring or the yearning for more that I've seen around the world with COVID. It seems like there's this mass, everywhere I've been looking, there've been lots of difficult things, but just everyone yearning for more. Something like that, something gives me hope about that, because I'm like, goodness, we all want the same thing, or something's happening inside everyone that's yearning for a little more. Something I could change. Oh man, in this part of the world, we need the economic reform. Somehow we need to give the country back to its people, and something about resources. I'd need to put it down more in probably a 3 hours webinar than a 1 hour one, but something about reform and the economy.
Alan, thank you. And Matthew, last but by no means least, where it's already Thursday morning, what's given you hope, and what would you, if there's one thing that you would change, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, during the COVID season, we've seen even in Singapore, beautiful moments where people have become a lot more aware of the fact that everybody, regardless of your race, your nationality background, your ethnic background, you go through disease together, and anyone, catching, the virus, it infects the whole community. So there's been a lot more. During this season, there's been, for instance, lockdowns, or at least mosques have not been able to open. There's been Ramadan has been celebrated in a season where people have not been able to conventionally gather. But you've seen a lot of conversation because of some of this. It has brought about lots of interest among the majority community, becoming a lot more aware about the importance, trying to understand what different communities need. So there's been a lot more display of human kindness, about care, about willingness to consider other people's cultural needs. So I think that's been great things to have come out, at least for us, during this pandemic season. There's one thing I want to see change. It's, of course, increasingly our societies accepting the kind of unconscious biases that we hold, calling it what it is, and learning to deal with that and move forward.
Matthew, Alan, Tebs, Mark, I know I've gone 10 minutes over, which is atrocious. Emma's going to have a go at me afterwards, but I think it was an incredibly important and enriching conversation. Thank you so much. We are delighted to have had you. It's going to be up on our website afterwards. Thank you again. Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Niz, and thank you very much to the panelists. That was a really amazing discussion. You've given us so much to think about. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and please join us again at the same time next Wednesday to discuss gender equality and the good society. Bye.
Bye.